Welcome back, History 1302, to another lecture here in class. And today the topic that we'll be covering is that of the Vietnam War. Now, we touched up on the Vietnam War just briefly in the 1960s, but today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that conflict and see how it will unfold between the 1950s all the way to the 1970s. And to understand this, we need to understand what leads to the outbreak of this conflict. And we'll see that its origins can date back all the way to the 19th century. Now, Vietnam, where it's located at today, or where it's located at in the world, it used to be a part of what was called French Indochina. This is where we see the modern-day nations of not only Vietnam, but as well as Laos and Cambodia. They had once been ruled for about 2 centuries by the French. This was a product of the imperialistic age. However, following World War II, we'd see that there was a growing Vietnamese independence movement to break away from French rule. And most notably, we'll see that of Ho Chi Minh would be leading a major faction in the northern portion of the country to bring about independence. Now, Ho Chi Minh himself had been protesting Vietnamese independence ever since the Treaty of Versailles, to where he had actually personally attended, however, failed to convince not only the French, but also the British and the Americans to support Vietnamese independence. However, because of this kind of rejection by the West, this would lead him to adopt communism, and by World War II, he would arrive back in Vietnam, and we'll see that as he institutes a communist regime in the years after the Second World War, Americans aren't going to support the Vietnamese, or the North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh. The French will look to reassert their authority after they had been occupied by the Germans in the region, and then we'll see that as they're conducting this war against the Vietnamese, they would find a very difficult foe in Ho Chi Minh. To make a long story short, eventually the French are going to lose and we will see some Vietnamese sovereignty. However, to try to contain communism, we'll see that the Western powers are going to divide up Vietnam both north and south. And just like in Korea, you would see communism would be present in the north, and in the south you'd have a more capitalistic system. However, that regime that would rule in the south under one Ngo Dinh Diem is going to be extremely unpopular. And because of his unpopularity, we will start to see the rise of a group that will try to bring about a downfall of the South Vietnamese government and a unification with the North Vietnamese government under a communist regime. And that group of guerrilla fighters that we'll see emerge in the South that will look to accomplish that would be a group known as the Viet Cong. Now, the Viet Cong, these guerrilla fighters, what we'll actually see is they'll create a great amount of instability within South Vietnam. At several points, we'll see that the regime under Ngo Dinh Diem was about to collapse, and because of their efforts and the growing unpopularity with Diem himself, we'll eventually see that he'll be assassinated in November of 1963. However, at this very important juncture, as we see the South Vietnamese government on the verge of collapse and perhaps communist takeover, this is where the United States is going to intervene. Now, the U.S. had already been involved in events over in Vietnam. When the French were combating the Vietnamese, we see that a lot of the funding going into that war came from the United States. And even afterwards, we see that the U.S. was uplifting the South Vietnamese government under Diem. And the whole reason for this was because they were sticking to that old Cold War policy to contain communism in the North. Because they were under the impression if they didn't do this, communism would not only spread to South Vietnam, but it would spread to Laos, Cambodia, and you would eventually see the communists take over the world. So they were looking to prevent that domino theory that we had talked about. And this is where by the beginning of the 1960s, we'll see that more funds would arrive over in Vietnam, but we also start to see the arrival of combat troops. First, there'll be military advisors who would train the South Vietnamese military. However, when it became prevalent that the only way that you could maintain the South Vietnamese government was to have the U.S. military there, this is where we'll see that under the Johnson administration, they would adopt the policy of escalation and begin to escalate the conflict. Now, under this policy of escalation, by the end of 1964, what we'll see is that more U.S. combat troops are going to arrive in Vietnam, and then we'll see that they would arrive on U.S. air bases by the beginning of 1965. At the height of the Vietnam War, we'll see some 500,000 Americans would serve on the ground conducting search and destroy missions, mainly targeting the Viet Cong military. Now, there's not going to be a formal declaration of war against the North Vietnamese government, but a state of war between the U.S. and North Vietnam will exist for the better portions of a decade. However, the enemy that the Americans are going to find is going to be a relatively difficult enemy to confront, mainly because, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Viet Cong, as well as we'll see with some portions of the North Vietnamese army, they're not going to fight in a traditional style in these large battles like we'd seen in World War II. But rather they're going to fight with more smaller tactics, or what are called guerrilla tactics, to where their forces would disguise themselves as civilians, work at night, conduct ambushes, and this is where we'll see that this strategy against the U.S. military will be quite effective. And this is why the war will drag on and ultimately become a war that the U.S. cannot win. And with these guerrillas on the prowl, we will see that there will be a series of massacres and atrocities committed against some civilian populations by American forces, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But as we see U.S. combat troops on the ground begin to arrive, we'll also see that Johnson's going to begin a sustained bombing campaign of North Vietnam to try to convince them to stay out of further escalating the conflict and hopefully to bomb them into submission to allow for the existence of South Vietnam. We see this begin with operations like Operation Rolling Thunder, but there will be other bombing campaigns that would take place during this war. And to put it in perspective, we'll see that over about 7.5 million tons of bombs are going to be dropped on in Southeast Asia during this conflict. That's almost double the amount that were dropped on both Germany and Japan during the course of World War II. But anyways, nonetheless, even with this bombing campaign, even as we see more and more American troops, America, by the time we get to 1968, was no closer to winning the war than 1965. But initially, most Americans will support this war as they were supporting trying to stop the spread of communism. But we do see there was a lot of discontent against the conduct of the Vietnam War, especially from college professors as well as college students. They begin to stage teach-ins within college classrooms by 1965, and we'll see that these would serve the basis eventually for the anti-war demonstrations that would occur a little bit later on. Well, as the war does drag on, we do see that it becomes increasingly unpopular. And with it, we'll see the rise of those anti-war demonstrations. And Americans increasingly were becoming divided amongst this topic. We'll see that a group of Americans who supported this war would fall into the group known as the Hawks, whereas a group who did not support this war fell into the group known as the Doves. But nonetheless, still, even by 1968 or the beginning of 1968, most Americans supported the war. But that will all change when we see the Tet Offensive take place in January of 1968. Now, I had mentioned the Tet Offensive the last time that we were in our online lectures, and during that lecture, I just briefly touched on it, but in January of 1968, what we'll see is the North Vietnamese military, as well as the Viet Cong forces, are going to launch 70,000 men against hundreds of villages, as well as about 40 cities all throughout South Vietnam. They're going to funnel in supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is a trail that goes throughout Laos as well as Cambodia. And we'll see that they would capture cities like Hue, as well as even threaten capture the American embassy in Saigon in the southern portion of the country. Now, tactically speaking, by March of 1968, we will see that the Tet Offensive ends in an American victory, but it's going to be a disaster back at the home front. Much of the Tet Offensive is going to be televised, and it's going to become clear to the American people that the federal government had been lying to them that they were close to winning this war. And this is where we'll see after the Tet Offensive, there's almost universal opposition to the Vietnam War. And this is also what contributed to why Johnson would basically be unelectable in 1968 and why he'll step down. But when he steps down, he does attempt to try to establish a negotiated peace, but Richard Nixon, as he's running in 1968, will violate the Logan Act and basically convince the North Vietnamese, wait to sign a peace deal, I'll sign a bit better one than Johnson will. And the war will continue on to the Nixon administration. But as it continues into the Nixon administration, it will become not more popular, but even less popular. Because even though he had campaigned stating that he would not only restore law and order, but he would also end the war in Vietnam, it won't come to immediate close. So now let's start to take a look at the Vietnam War as it begins to unfold during the Nixon administration. So focusing on the Nixon administration, we'll see that when he takes office, this was the height of the Vietnam War for the United States. We see over 500,000 American combat troops are on the ground there, but beginning with Nixon, he will begin to adopt a policy of gradual withdrawal. And a part of this policy of gradually withdrawing American troops, he would also promote a policy known as Vietnamization. During the Johnson years, the Vietnam War had become Americanized, and the only reason that you see South Vietnam really staying in place was because the U.S. military was there. However, through this process of Vietnamization, what the U.S. military would begin to do in regards to the South Vietnamese army is they would begin to train them up so they could defend themselves on their own accord as American troops begin to withdraw. But even with these policies in place, we'll see that during the Nixon years, he would continue the bombing campaigns, and we'll even see that he would support an invasion into Cambodia. And with things like that happening, we'll see that this would make his administration, or I shouldn't say his administration, but the Vietnam War even more unpopular. On top of that, as we see those things occurring, we'll also see that rumors begin to arrive back in the U.S. of massacres, most notably that of the My Lai massacre that occurs that takes place at the village of My Lai. Now, in this massacre, what we'll see is a U.S. officer is going to order basically the rape and execution of about 600 600 villagers of My Lai. This would make major headways, but there will be other reports of what was going on back over in Vietnam as well, generating further discontent with the war. On top of that, we'll also see the anti-war demonstrators at Kent State are going to be shot at by the National Guard, increasingly adding to why this war was unpopular. However, even as we get into 1971 and 1972, the war had yet to come to an end. Because Nixon, just like Johnson before him, wanted to establish a negotiated peace to where North Vietnam agreed to not invade South Vietnam and take it over. However, as those negotiations begin to stall in the summer of 1972, Nixon will ramp up bombing efforts once again. And this would lead to widespread demonstrations not only in the U.S., but also across the world. But eventually, by January of 1973, after almost a decade in the war, we will see that this conflict would come to an end, when we see that North Vietnam as well as South Vietnam and the United States agreed to the Paris Peace Accords. And through the Paris Peace Accords, the North Vietnamese government basically assures the United States that they will not invade Vietnam the day after the U.S. leaves. But South Vietnam will eventually fall to the communists. Because when the last U.S. troops withdraw in March of 1973, it will be less than 2 years later before we see North Vietnamese troops invading South Vietnam. Now, with the Vietnam War officially over, we will see that the U.S., as they begin to withdraw from the region, they're going to leave a very bitter legacy in Vietnam. Most notably, what we'll see is not only is the country of Vietnam itself greatly shaken by this conflict, but we'll also see that America's dedication to that policy of containment, instead of containing communism, they're actually going to have it spread within Southeast Asia through their involvement. Because of American involvement, as well as bombing campaigns in Laos as well as Cambodia, both of those countries are going to fall to communism. And shortly after that happens, we then see that South Vietnam will fall to communism. In April of 1975, there would be a massive North Vietnamese invasion of South Vietnam, and by the end of that month, Saigon would be in North Vietnamese control. Americans would watch on live television that night, and with it, they would see America lose its first war. And it will be a very bitter legacy that Americans are going to have to address for years to come, because we will see that the Vietnam War, not only is it going to generate a great amount of distrust by the federal government, but it's also going to leave a lot of bitter legacies for Americans, especially in regards to those old Cold War policies. And it's no surprise that during the 1970s we start to see a revision of some of those policies. But anyways, that's a topic that we'll discuss with the Nixon administration in the future. But anyways, we'll go ahead and we'll end on that note. But anyways, before we end, just like always, just as a reminder, make sure that you complete all outstanding assignments, watch all videos, as well as review all textbook chapters. But otherwise, if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll see everybody in the next video.